Okay, this is Revolutionary War Part 2, and we're still looking at our extended comparison of the two sides in the Revolutionary War. And we're going to be looking at what I call British special problems. I always put quotes around special problems. Now, as we saw last time on paper, the British look like they've got overwhelming, crushing advantages in every major area of comparison, which is true, they do, but that in war, as in, let's say, football, that's not the whole story because they have some realities they may not have seen coming. Though I think their pattern of approach here indicates that they may have up to a point. There are some realities that they're going to have to find a way to compensate for or work around in order to carry this out successfully. So we'll just plunge right in. To begin with, at the time the Revolutionary War broke out, Britain's resources, by which I mean their army and their navy in this case, they're fully extended. They've cut their army back as far as they can cut it. Their navy, they haven't kept up with new construction or maintenance like they should have. And so they're stretched very thin, covering a larger empire than they ever have before. And that means that they could fight one short, brief, win it quick and get out war in one place against one enemy. And then only by pulling troops and ships away from where they need to be and concentrating them wherever the war is, hope to win it quick and get everybody back where they started from without making the initial problem worse. The initial problem that caused all this is that they're up against it financially. They've raised their taxes sky high, borrowed themselves stupid during the French and Indian War, and now they've got this tax protest going on in America. Got to find a way to put that fire out as cheaply as they can. So that's going to be a tough one. Their military and naval resources already fully extended, and they can't let this get into some kind of long stretched out war. Okay, next thing, and that this makes the first problem way worse. They've got no allies. The fancy term for that is diplomatic isolation, because they look at the map of Western Europe and all they see is enemies and potential enemies, starting with France. France was deeply humiliated by the way the French and Indian War turned out and the territory in America that they lost, and they're looking for revenge. They're getting ready for a rematch. And the French monarchy has been spending money it didn't have, building up their army and their navy, and of course their resources are much greater than those of Britain. And in fact, they're creating problems that will lead to the outbreak of the French Revolution just a few years later. So you got France. The country that was Britain's ally in the French and Indian War on the continent was part of what's now part of Germany, called Prussia. And the king, when the war started, was George II, and I believe Pitt's government, whatever government was under him, George II, they're paying the Prussians basically for their support. And so Prussia's out here keeping France tied down on the continent and being invaded on all fronts. If Prussia had not had a military genius as a king, known to history as Frederick the Great, they might have perished. Here's Frederick the Great dragging his army from one frontier to another. And then George II of England died, and George III came in, and he cut off the money payments, let them hung out to dry. So they do not have warm, fuzzy feelings in their hearts for the Brits. The Austrians, the Spanish are a long-term enemy, plus there's just a bit of resentment for the British because French and Indian War made them the number one power for the first time. That doesn't always work out well for you, diplomatically isolated. Britain's always had allies. They're not that big. that maybe our revolution will be maybe twice in the last 500 years or since nation states arose that they've gone to war without help. All right. Another thing is they're about to learn a lesson here in how difficult it is for a government which depends on public support to wage a lengthy, expensive war. Because the longer any war goes on, the more distant victory appears to be, the more expensive it gets, the more unpopular it's going to be. So Britain never really had a strong political consensus in support of the war, and I'm never going to been able to get that down to like a bumper sticker level slogan thing, like a heading. But let's just say a deteriorating political consensus for the war. Previous wars, political consensus hadn't really been an issue. People sort of took it for granted. Wars were not total all-out wars. They were dynastic wars. They were not national wars, as somebody's pointed out, because nationalism hadn't yet quite made the scene yet. So this one's going to be different. Previous wars, the enemies had always been the usual suspects: the French, the Spanish, the French and the Spanish. Nobody had a problem with that. That's why God made Frenchmen, for British soldiers to shoot. And it's not controversial. This time, the enemy is different. The enemy is other Englishmen. And what are these other Englishmen mad about? What's their beef? Well, listen to what they're saying. They appear to be taking up exactly where English political, popular political movements left off in the previous century. They can quote their John Locke chapter and verse. They were giving a justification for when it's okay to fire the king. So this makes it tough. So there were a lot of Englishmen who were not fully supportive. Now, it's not like there's war protests. It's not like very many of them wanted us to win. Some of them did. It's more like, what's up with this? What bunch of idiots in London have screwed this up so bad that the colonists, who've always been taken for granted loyal, are in armed uprising? How did that happen? Who are these guys? Now, as I say, there were a few Englishmen who were cheering us on. They had their share of political radicals who feared the monarchy. And the problem they saw with this was that if the king, whom they did not trust, because he's trying to restore some personal power, if the king should succeed in suppressing the rights of Englishmen in America through the use of military force, if he succeeds at that in America, are you willing to bet your life that he's not going to try it later in England itself? So there were some people on the fringe over in England who saw this war as, we're not just fighting for our freedoms, we're fighting for theirs too. So you cannot maintain a long, drawn-out struggle under those political conditions, as we have learned to our sorrow more than once. Okay. Let's see. This one, as far as the military, okay, there were now British soldiers in the ranks. They just go where they're sent and do what they're told. Officers may be thinking a bit more deeply, and there were maybe 2 or 3 of Britain's best generals who kind of made a big show of announcing that they would resign their commissions before they would accept orders to go to America and fight against other Englishmen. They considered us to be other Englishmen. Kind of what in the 60s was called radical chic, C-H-I-C. That's fashionable to be radical. I guess we've learned about that again lately, haven't we? Well, one particular general, whose name looks like it ought to have a question mark after it, did that. He refused to go to America, fight other Englishmen, and his name was William Howe, H-O-W-E, William Howe. When he was offered command of the largest British army to leave the British Isles in the entire 18th century, he couldn't pass that up. So he and his older brother, Admiral Lord Richard Howe, the ones who brought a big British army over in 1776 and continued the struggle from there on. The Howe brothers had an odd dual mission. We're taking this a little bit out of order to illustrate my point. They had the power and the ability to wage war against the rebellion and try to snuff it out. At the same time, they were fully authorized to be peace commissioners and work out an agreement with the colonists to end the war. So what you see here is that the Howe brothers and the government who sent them were hoping for a low-impact victory through sheer intimidation. They're going to bring this huge army that we could not possibly defeat, and in a way we didn't. We just wore them down. That we would take one look at that army, realize that resistance is futile, throw down our guns, and hurry to the conference table. When that didn't happen, what are you going to do? Howe had 2 or 3 good chances to end the war by snuffing out George Washington's ragged little army. He always pulled his punches for one reason or another. He didn't get it done. Ended up being recalled to London to answer some really tough questions about how it was that 32,000 professional soldiers was not enough to do this. Okay. Then there were some tactical problems. I want to make sure that's what's next. I know I wrote the thing. There were some tactical problems. In warfare, strategy is the grand plan. Tactics are the ways and means. And I'm going to use a term here, theater of war. That's the English pronunciation. Accent on the first syllable, spelled T-H-E-T-R-E. This, in warfare, is the geographical area within which the war is waged. Okay, as in World War II, we have the European theater, the Pacific theater, the Central Asian theater, and so on. In this case, the theater of war was the 13 colonies. So 2 things connected with that. One, the distance to the theater of war. The British Army is accustomed, across the English Channel, quick, easy communication, no big supply problems. Atlantic Ocean is 3,000 miles across. It takes a while to make that trip, 3 weeks maybe, at least. So that means your communications are slow. That means that supply is iffy because the North Atlantic increasingly is crawling with American privateers. Reinforcement, it's difficult. And they'll have to find a way to compensate for that. So the distance to the theater of war, I should tell you this. If America had never grown beyond the proclamation line of 1763 running down the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, we would still be way bigger than any West European country. For that matter, Texas is larger than any West European country. So they were not accustomed to an area that large that had that poor transportation infrastructure. They made mistakes. Now, the man commanding this whole thing was he had the title Secretary of State for America, Lord George Germain, who had made a questionable decision as a British officer in a battle one time. He got drummed out of the army and had it entered into his record that he was unfit for any military duty, whatever. Now he's a civilian running the war effort. He understood about the communications being slow, and so he erred in the opposite direction. He gave his field commander so many options it just left him like, what do I do? So you can see here that just the reality of the situation is making it difficult for them. So the size of the theater of war, the distance to the theater of war are both big problems for the British. When we get to part 3, everybody can really sort of stop and focus when I get to this. A huge British advantage is going to become a liability because of choices the British generals themselves made. That has to do with how armies fought in the 18th century and why they fought that way. So that'll be in part 3.